So Antoine Falisse received his bachelor degree in engineering science in 2012 from UC Louvain in Belgium, master's in biomedical engineering in 2014, again from UC Louvain in Belgium, and PhD in biomedical science in 2019 from KU Leuven, also in Belgium. The main focus of his doctoral research was the development of models and methods for personalized modeling and predictive simulations to study gait in children with CP. And following his PhD, he stayed at KU Leuven for a short postdoc before moving to Stanford University, where he is now. And his postdoctoral research is primarily about using commodity videos to inform dynamic simulation of human movement. So please join me in welcoming Antoine. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks very much for having me today. It's a real pleasure to take part in the conference. And yeah, during this presentation, I'll try to talk about what I did during my PhD. So mostly predictive simulations of walking. And then I'll talk about what I'm doing now as a postdoc, which is mainly about using smartphone videos as input for simulations. So let's start with the predictive simulations. And here I'd like to thank Dr. Pendy because he gave a great introduction to what I want to talk about today. So predictive simulations generate novel movement patterns based on the neuromusculoskeletal model without relying on experimental data. So here you see an example of a predictive simulation of walking. So we only have a model, there is no data involved here. And we believe that these simulations, they might be useful to inform treatment decisions. The idea would be to simulate the effect of different treatments, and then we can inform clinicians about which treatment is best for a specific patient. So this would be very valuable, especially for neuromuscular disorders like cerebral palsy, where both the motor control system and the musculoskeletal system are impaired. And this makes it very hard to identify what impairments are causing walking deficits, and therefore what treatments should be selected, because there are many available treatments, so to speak. So if we could capture the effect of impairments in models, we could then simulate the effect of treatments, and this might improve treatment outcomes. And treatment outcomes in the last decades have been modest, stagnant, and predictable. So there is a lot better we can do if we can use tools like modeling and simulations. So in the next few slides, I'll present some of the work we've been doing towards this goal. But let me first explain in more detail what I mean by a walking simulation and present one approach we use to generate predictive simulations of walking. So walking simulation is based on a model of how the neural and the musculoskeletal systems interact. So we have first the central nervous system that generates muscle excitations. These excitations result in muscle forces and will produce joint torques, which together with the external forces will make the skeleton move. So if you have the right set of muscle excitations, you might obtain a walking simulation. But how do we find the muscle excitations such as to obtain a walking simulation? Well, one assumption we can make is that the structures in the central nervous system, they are distributed such that muscle excitations optimize performance during walking. And this assumption allows us to formulate predictive simulations as optimal control problems, where the goal is to identify the set of muscle excitations that optimize a certain performance criterion while satisfying the constraints of the musculoskeletal model, as well as other constraints related to the movement itself. So typically for predicting walking, we impose periodicity and we want the model to walk at a predefined walking speed. And those are constraints we can impose to our problem. However, these problems are very hard to solve. They're quite big, especially when we use complex musculoskeletal models with many degrees of freedom and many muscles. But we need these complex models if we want to use modeling and simulation for clinical applications. So to give you some rough estimates, researchers needed about 10,000 hours of computational time to generate simulations of walking about 20 years ago. And it went down to about 15 hours a couple of years ago. And a lot of this pioneer work has been done in the lab of Dr. Pandey. So we think that 15 hours is still quite a long time, especially if you want to use simulations for research questions or for clinical applications. So in the past years, we have been working a lot on trying to make these simulations faster. And our approach has been to combine advanced numerical methods and software in a simulation framework. So the framework we used relies on OpenSim for the musculoskeletal modeling part and on Casadi for the numerical optimization part. So this is about software. In terms of methods, we combined 3 key numerical methods to generate fast simulations. The first one is to use direct collocation methods instead of more traditional shooting methods. We also used implicit differential equations instead of explicit differential equations. And finally, we use automatic differentiation instead of finite differences to compute derivatives. So I'll not have time today to go into the technical details, but the key point I want you to get out of this is that together, this simulation framework allowed us to generate predictive simulations of walking with complex musculoskeletal models in less than 30 minutes. So it's getting quite fast, and it's a speed that is, let's say, good enough to try to start like exploring like research questions, clinical applications. So now that we have an efficient simulation framework, we can exploit it to study research questions. And the first question we had was, basically, which performance criterion should we optimize to produce walking simulation? So for instance, we could optimize for metabolic energy expenditure, for muscle fatigue, for stability. These are all like valid criteria, and probably us as human beings, we take into account all these criteria when we walk. So which one should we optimize to generate decent simulations? So to answer this question, we generated simulations with different criteria, and we evaluated the resulting motions and compared them to experimental walking data. And what we found is that optimizing for a combination of energy expenditure, muscle fatigue, and joint accelerations resulted in human-like walking simulations. And importantly, all the terms in the cost function were important. So if we removed the energy expenditure term, for instance, we had a simulation with too much trunk sway. If we removed the muscle fatigue term, we had very high muscle activations. And if we removed the joint acceleration term, for instance, the motion was not as smooth. So now that we have like a template predictive simulation of walking, we can use it for answering clinical questions, so at least go in that direction. And this is what we did with data from a child with cerebral palsy. So we were interested to see whether we could use these simulations to inform about treatment decisions. So I'll present briefly a case study we worked on. So we had this child with cerebral palsy walking in crouch, meaning that he's walking with excessive knee flexion. And we wanted to know what should be the main treatment targets to restore an upright gait posture for this child. So we also knew that the child had bone deformities, had bilateral spasticity, but he had a good muscle strength and selectivity. So to answer this question, we personalized our framework or models to try to capture the effect of the impairments on the walking pattern. So we did this personalization at different levels. So first, we personalized the muscle models to capture the effect of altered muscle properties, such as muscle contracture. Then we personalized the musculoskeletal geometry based on medical images to model the effect of bone deformities. And finally, we added personalized sensory feedback models in our framework to capture the effect of muscle spasticity. So once we had done these different personalizations, we could then simulate in isolation the influence of the impairments and therefore infer what could be the main treatment targets. So I'll briefly present some of our results. So here we tested what would be the effect of taking into account the altered muscle properties. So we have two models. The one in orange has unaltered muscle properties, so basically the generic muscle models. And the model in green has altered muscle properties. So it has personalized muscle models. And when we generate our predictive simulations, what we found is that the green model here is walking in crouch, suggesting that the altered muscle properties are causing the child to walk in crouch. So we generated lots of different simulations. We also found, for instance, that muscle spasticity had no effect on walking for this particular child. And we came to the conclusion that the best treatment target for this child should be the muscle properties. And what is quite interesting is that we then look at what clinicians had actually done with this child, because this case study was based on retrospective data. And the child actually had an orthopedic surgery during which they corrected for bone deformities and altered muscle properties. And this restored an upright gait pattern. So this suggests that this is quite aligned with our simulation-based findings. And overall, this suggests that our simulation framework might be able to identify treatment targets for a specific patient. So of course, there is much more to be done to validate these results. It's only one case study with a few simulations, but I think it's a good sign. It's very promising in a sense of there is something to do with those computational models to help inform about what are the best treatments for specific individuals. So now I'd like to end this part of the talk by just mentioning a few of the challenges that I think are lying ahead. I think there are 4 areas where we should focus our attention on. The first one is about motor control. For instance, the simulations I presented, there is no real controller. We're just optimizing muscle excitations for certain performance criteria. But we know that there are many control structures involved in the control of locomotion. So it would be very good to start incorporating these control structures in our models. The second point here is about robustness. So the framework I presented is based on deterministic simulations. There is no noise involved, and we know that there is noise in our sensory system. And it's been shown in previous research that accounting for uncertainty improves the realism of simulations. So I think that's also an area for future research. Third, we also need to make our models more expressive, better representative of the physiology. So for instance, the muscle models we're using, the contact models we're using, they're very simple in a certain way, and they don't really represent what is actually happening. So if we can start bringing what we know about muscle physiology, I believe we will get better simulations in the future. And finally, I'm glad Dr. Pandey talked about that too. Personalization is very important if we want to use simulations, for instance, in clinical practice, where it's important to be subject specific. It's also very hard to personalize our models and very time consuming. So there is a lot of work to be done in that area. Of course, working on that should also be made together with thinking about computational efficiency. We need to find a good trade-off there. And I think the future will be made of a mix of physics-based models, but also data-driven models. So using machine learning models where we have a lot of data, we can train very good models, and this might help us have good simulations. All right, so that was the first part about how can predictive simulations help in, for instance, predictions of treatment outcomes or for answering research questions. Now I'd like to talk also about how data-informed simulations can be useful. And I see them as very useful, for instance, to do some functional assessments of physical capabilities. So in the motion capture lab, we can measure movement to assess functional capabilities. We can estimate kinematic and kinetic measures like joint angles and moments. And we can also generate muscle-driven simulations to estimate things like muscle forces, joint loading, for instance. And these measures are very insightful, and they're used by physical therapists, by clinicians. But this process is also resource intensive. So the equipment used in the lab costs around $50,000 for like force plates, motion capture, EMGs. And collecting, processing, and simulating data can take an expert hours to several days. So for biomechanical measures to inform clinical practice and large-scale research studies, we need tools that are as accurate and informative as motion capture, but much faster and more scalable. So several simpler tools exist for accurately measuring kinematics. So we have IMUs, we have commercial markerless motion capture systems, and they can measure kinematics quite accurately. So with, for instance, 5 degrees of error. Another potentially very scalable motion capture technique could be using open source pose estimation algorithms like OpenPose on videos collected with smartphones. So we all have smartphones. So if we can leverage that for biomechanical analysis, that would be fantastic. So what you get out of processing videos with a pose detection algorithm is a set of key points on certain landmarks of the human body. And these key points have been used already as input to like deep learning models to predict some task-specific biomechanical quantities. However, this approach is not generalizable enough to replicate the motion capture lab. So there is a need for generalizable tool for measuring 3D kinematics, but also kinetics from smartphone videos. And that's the need we addressed by developing OpenCap, which is a new software package from our lab to estimate 3D human movement kinematics, but also dynamics from smartphone videos. So here is a quick demo of how OpenCap works. So all you need is at least 2 smartphones or 2 iPads, 2 iPods. You need a printed out checkerboard, and you need a laptop on which you can run a web application. So to start a data collection with OpenCap, you just log into our web application. And then you can start a session. You get a QR code that you will scan from our iOS application. And this will connect the phones to the web app. Then the next step is to calibrate the cameras. This is why you need a checkerboard. You do that from the web application. You just click record, and it calibrates the cameras. Then you provide some information about the subjects, like a weight and height, and you use a standing neutral pose to scale a musculoskeletal model. And once you have done that, you can start collecting data. So for instance, you ask the subject to run. So this is me, I'm running on the tracks. As soon as we stop recording, the videos are sent to the cloud, and a minute later, you can visualize the kinematics on the web application. And this is task agnostic, so you can also do like a cut, and like a minute later, you can visualize the kinematics. And as I said, we go one step further. We also analyze the kinetics. So we can generate muscle-driven simulations. And for the running trial I just showed before, we can extract data like ground reaction forces, joint loading, joint torques, muscle forces, basically anything you would get from a dynamic simulation. So that's OpenCap in a nutshell. Let's take a look at the 3 big components of the platform. So we have an iOS application that enables simultaneous video capture. We have a lightweight web application that guides users through data collection and visualization. And then all of the processing happens using scalable cloud computing. So there are 4 steps there. The first step is running an open source pose estimation algorithm like OpenPose. We then triangulate the video key point positions to get 3D video key points. These are the blue dots you see there. However, this is a pretty sparse marker set, so it's pretty hard to run accurately like biomechanical analysis. So we trained the deep learning model to estimate anatomical markers from the video markers. So basically from the blue markers, we predict the red markers using a deep learning models. And these markers are the same as the one you would get from a motion capture lab. So then you can use these markers to run inverse kinematics and get joint angles, joint velocities, accelerations. And finally, you can run muscle-driven dynamic simulations to get kinetic variables. So in terms of validation, we validated OpenCap against marker-based motion capture and force plates. We had errors in kinematics under 5 degrees. errors in ground reaction forces between 1 and 10% body weight, and the average kinetic error was about 1% body weight times height. So these are very promising results. But what we cared really about is to see whether OpenCap could be used for research and clinical applications. So one such application is estimating measures of knee loading, like the knee adduction moment and the medial knee contact force, because these measures relate to osteoarthritis progression. So we had 10 participants walk naturally and then with a trunk sway gait modification, which is a gait modification that typically alters these loading measures. And we found that OpenCap may be accurate enough to identify individuals with a high knee adduction moment who are at risk of rapid disease progression. We also found that OpenCap could detect changes in loading measures that are induced by the gait modification, indicating that it could be useful to study between condition differences in a research setting, but also it could be used to potentially personalize rehabilitation interventions in a clinical setting. Finally, we also wanted to explore how useful OpenCap is for out-of-lab data collections. So we had a clinician without any motion capture experience collect data from 100 individuals on campus performing squats and asymmetric squats. And OpenCap was able to identify knee extension moment asymmetries, as well as between condition improvements in symmetry with more than 80% accuracy. And it suggests that it could be useful for tracking rehabilitation progress. But what is really exciting here is that it only took about 5 minutes per person to collect the data, which is more than 25 times faster than what it would have taken in lab. And assuming you had to buy new devices, the whole setup is still more than 200 times cheaper than a motion capture lab. If you already have access to iPhones or iPads, it's less than $50. So OpenCap is live. We launched it about a month ago now, and it's free for researchers to use. So I invite you to visit our website, opencap.ai. You can find instructions on how to get started. And you can also find a link to our preprint that you can also find on bioRxiv. So I'm really excited about the perspectives that OpenCap is opening. I think it will really enable computational modeling to more widely inform musculoskeletal healthcare. And to relate back to the topic of the workshop, I think this is typically the type of technology that will help us guide physical therapy in the future. So that was a pretty dense presentation, but I would like to thank you very much for your attention. I just would like to mention that you can find the code used for the predictive simulations or for OpenCap online. So you can find most of the code on my GitHub. I would like to thank my collaborators, my sponsors, and I'm happy to take any question, and please feel free to reach out if you have additional questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Antoine. I think we all share the excitement about the OpenCap. Any questions? There is one question.
Yeah, I'm just curious about how Kinetic OpenCap is.
How robust is with respect to what?
To like changes in shoot type or terrain.
Ah, okay. So how robust is the kinetic measurement in OpenCap with respect to, say, changing shoes changing or environment and so on?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess the answer is, for now, we use some contact models, and there are some parameters you can tune on the contact models that could represent sort of different like surfaces or shoe types. For now, we use some generic parameters, so we didn't really look into that. I don't think it's impossible to model different shoe types. I don't think it's easy either. Yeah, so would say it's, yeah, for now we use just generic models.
Okay, one more quick one and we need to move on. Go on.
Yeah, my question is about the first part of the presentation. Say that for predictive simulation, they use lots of terms in their class function. I want to say how they decide about the contribution of each term in their class function. Or
Okay, so the question.
the base of each term, how they decide about.
So the question is, in the first part, when you talk about predictive simulations, you have cost function that has multiple terms. How do you decide on the contributions, essentially on the weights of each?
Yeah.
Yeah,
thanks for the question. It's a good one. I was a pretty naive PhD student when I was doing that, so it was a lot of trials and errors, and I think there are much better methods to select those weights, but I basically tried a lot until I was happy with the results. I then started trying to do some some inverse optimal control. So basically you start from experimental data and you try to infer the weights from the experimental data without tracking while still predicting. I haven't been very successful in my attempts. Other people have been using simpler models. So I think there is something to do there. But yeah, to answer your question, it was just like trials and errors. And we picked the terms first based on what others had been doing.
Okay, just you have or have not been successful in IOC? I didn't understand.
I have not.
It did.
You have not.
It
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you very much. We need to move on with our last speaker for the first session. So let's just one more time. Antoine.